Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Velero community meeting. Hope you're all having a fantastic week so far. My name is Jonas Rossland. I'll be your moderator for today. We have a pretty well-packed agenda, some really interesting stuff that we want to talk about. If you have any questions or feedback or comments on anything here today, please just voice them or put them in the chat if you have some questions. You're in a location where you can't speak. This is being recorded. We'll post it up on YouTube, so make sure you don't say anything or do anything that you don't want to be recorded for all eternity. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Steve to take it away.
Cool, thanks, Jonas. Yeah, so wanted to start with kind of an update on what we've been working on. And actually, Jonas, do you want to share the agenda, or do you want me to just share it?
I can share it. Give me 1 second.
Sure. So the biggest thing that we have to update on is that yesterday we released the first alpha for our 1.0 release. So we felt that we were kind of close enough to feature complete that it was worth getting a pre-release out there for anyone who wants to start testing it. And so we're pretty excited about that. We're still targeting a GA release for 1.0 in the mid-May timeframe. So we plan to have a number of additional alphas and betas prior to that, but the first one's out there so folks can start testing it. And Jonas, actually, if you click on that link, the first alpha link, we'll pull up the release notes. So you can see here an exhaustive list of all the changes. Definitely read the highlights section. Those are a few of the biggest new features or changes. Actually, since Nolan and Carlicia did a lot of work on a couple of those, I'll give them a chance to talk about those features. So Nolan, you want to talk briefly about Velero install?
Yeah, so Velero install is a new command we're adding to mostly for our quick start documentation. So this will get you up and running on GCP, AWS, and Azure more quickly without having to apply a bunch of YAML and go in and edit those files. We're still talking about some behaviors on it, but it should mostly be there. And I've got a PR noted in the HackMD for documentation for it. So if people could try that out and see how it's worked for them, if they have any feedback, we'd love to hear it. Also not on here, I've been working on reviewing the Helm chart that Joseph Gorse has been working on to get Velero, or Arc renamed to Velero, in the Helm repo.
Cool, thanks. And then Carlicia, do you want to just do a quick overview of the plugin changes?
Yeah, sure. So we did a significant refactoring of the plugin code. So now it's very, well, the first and foremost, the most benefit is that for plugin authors that are going to update to the new version, and you do have to recompile your plugins to run with what's going to be our version 1.0, because we changed the version protocol, so there's not going to be compatibility. So they have to do that. And so for that version, if the plugin author blows up the Velero folder on the vendor and redo it, the amount of stuff that's going to go in there is going to be very, very tight, much smaller than before. And so that's one thing. Another thing is that if you look through the Velero codes, you will see clearly what is the plugin client codes that Velero uses for our own plugins, and what is the plugin framework codes, which is what the authors need for the plugins. And we added some examples to the documentation on the Velero side, and it's going to be just, I think, a lot more clear how to develop a plugin and what code you can use. What else? Yeah, so Steve also added some codes so that on the Velero plugin side, errors will contain the stack trace information, and the panics will be handled much better. we had an external contribution so that for the restore plugins, we are keeping out the original item that's being restored. Before we didn't do that. What else? And I was actually out on Friday, so I'm not totally clear if the name collision went into the alpha release. It did? Good. So before, we didn't check to see if there was a naming collision for plugin names, and now we do. So as you're trying to add a plugin, if one already exists with that name, you will be it will show up on the log, and you won't be able to add that plugin. And with that change, we also added new formats for the plugin name. So now you can sort of namespace it with subdomain, like with a name, with a prefix and a name, prefix/name, that's the format. And the prefix has to be a DNS, a valid DNS subdomain name. And that's all documented. So now you can, that's just to make it easier for you to have multiple plugins, even if you want to have the same name. I think I covered everything.
Yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. Thanks. Yeah, so we're feeling good about these features, but there are also a whole host of other changes that went in around user experience and stability. So we're hoping that this release is a pretty good one that helps folks be more successful with Velero. Definitely worth noting that there are some breaking changes. This is a 1.0, and so the biggest area where there are changes are that we're completely removing all vestiges of the old Arc API and any related code. So as of 1.0, there's only the Velero API group, no more references to Arc. And so kind of a lot of the annotations, labels, et cetera, that we had been continuing to support during 0.11 that referenced Arc are no longer supported. So we'll have kind of detailed upgrade instructions. If you're already on 0.11, you should be in pretty good shape to upgrade to 1.0. But if you're not yet on 0.11, definitely recommended to upgrade to that before making the jump to 1.0. So I don't think we need to go through all of the details of the changelog, but definitely take a look so that you can see what those changes are. And so with that, Nolan, I know you already sort of covered the stuff that you've been working on. Did you have anything more to mention around install or the Helm chart?
Excuse me, not really. I guess the one thing is the team are fairly new to Helm, and I do know there's some issues with testing the Helm chart upstream. So if anybody would want to take a look at that and help us and Joseph figure out what the end-to-end test failures are, that would be super helpful.
Cool. And then Carlicia, did you want to cover anything on what you've been working on, the naming collision or the protobuf refactoring beyond what you covered already? Yeah,
so the name collision I just described, and that's in the alpha release, and the protobuf refactoring also is on the alpha release. I don't think it affects the external users. We were sharing some types before, and we just separated that to refactoring.
Yeah, so that should be mostly internal refactoring. That shouldn't affect users or really plugin developers. Yeah, so I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about this issue that I have linked, number 1371, if you could open that, Jonas. And I think I talked about this a little bit in the last meeting, but wanted to cover it again. So one of the issues that we'd like to tackle for 1.0 is kind of rationalizing the phases that we use for backups and restores. And so, this issue kind of summarizes the current state. So today, backups or restores can end in one of three phases. And so the first phase there is failed validation, which essentially means that the backup or restore spec was invalid. So an example of this is if you create a restore and you specify a backup that you want to restore that doesn't actually exist in the cluster, it'll fail validation. If you create a backup and you say, I want to include namespace A and I also want to exclude namespace A, that's an invalid backup spec. So those will move into the failed validation phase. And then we have, for backups or restores that are processed, we have the completed and failed phases. And the meaning of these phases is a little bit inconsistent between backups and restores. So for backups, completed means that there were no errors executing the backup. So every item was backed up successfully. The tarball was uploaded to object storage. For restores though, a restore can be completed even if there are kind of individual errors or errors restoring individual items. So, you know, if you execute a restore and most of your resources are restored successfully, but maybe one persistent volume fails to restore, the restore will still end in the completed phase, but it will have an error count of greater than 0. And if you run Velero restore describe, you'll see the errors that happened. So definitely some inconsistency there. And then, you know, similarly, failed is slightly different between the two operations. So for backups, if there's at least one error, the backup ends up as failed. It is possible that that even if the backup is failed, there's still a tarball and metadata in object storage, so it may still be restorable. But you know, kind of similarly here, if a single resource fails to back up, so if a persistent volume snapshot fails for some reason, the backup will end up as failed. For restores though, it means that there was some kind of fatal error. So for example, not being able to download the backup tarball from object storage. So yeah, some inconsistency here. And so we really want to make the phases consistent. And so if you look at kind of the meaning of the phases, it really seems like there are kind of 3 distinct conditions that we want to capture. So there's kind of the completed with no errors result, where, you know, the entire backup or the entire restore completed successfully and there were no errors. And so I'm proposing that we start using that completed phase to mean no errors encountered. There's then the condition where there's some kind of fatal error. So for a backup, this could be that the backup fails to upload to object storage. For restores, it could mean that the restore failed or the backup fails to download from object storage. And so essentially, there is no result. And so I'm proposing that the failed phase means that there was a kind of a fatal error encountered. And then there's kind of this in-between phase where the backup or the restore largely executed, but perhaps some individual resources failed to back up or restore. So kind of like the persistent volume case that I was talking about before. And so I think we want to introduce a new phase that captures this state where it's not a complete success. It's also not a complete failure. It's somewhere in between. And I think this is useful because for the user, it differentiates between a total failure and a partial failure. And so for a backup, for example, you know, if a backup ends in this phase, it means that there's still a tarball in object storage that could be restored from, but it potentially does not contain all of the resources that you expected to be backed up because there was some error. Similarly with restores, this phase would indicate that some of your resources were restored into your cluster, but not all of them were applied correctly. And so we just want to make it really clear to the user that, that in this phase, it was partially completed, but there are still issues that the user probably needs to look into. So we're still sort of trying to lock down the name here. So a couple of options for this phase are, you know, completed with errors or partially failed. So it kind of depends on whether you look at it as a glass half full or glass half empty kind of thing. Definitely if anyone has input on the kind of the most descriptive name here, that'd be useful. And also if folks have input on whether it makes sense to add this third phase or whether something else would make more sense to them, please add comments to this issue. It's issue 1371 in GitHub. There are a couple of additional items that we might tackle after 1.0, but basically adding this third phase and then changing the code so that backups and restores are assigned the correct phase based on what happens is work we'd like to do for 1.0. So if anyone has comments or questions on that now, definitely jump in. Otherwise, feel free to comment on the GitHub issue. Well, I'm definitely going to be starting to work on this pretty soon in the next day or two. So, you know, timely feedback is definitely appreciated.
Does anyone have any comments or feedback regarding the naming here? All right, I have one comment. So completed with errors, just from an end user perspective, if I do something and it's completed with errors, I would be less inclined to investigate what those errors were because it was kind of completed. But if something was partially failed, I think that would kind of make me think, oh my God, something failed. That's not good. I need to investigate what that is. I think that resonates with me at least. So partially failed would be my my go-to here.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I was sort of leaning towards something like that, indicating that that something failed, would definitely make user more likely to look into it. So that was kind of the way I was leaning.
Yeah, so similar to if you go through the logs, then you can have fail as kind of a regex as well. So as soon as you hit fail, you see that there's something really bad going on here. With completed with errors, we just see an error, which we might not look that much into.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks for the input.
Anyone else have any comments or feedback there?
I just do another comment about it. I just because I've run into this a bit myself from the plugin side, is that right now, a backup, any error fails in a restore, you get this kind of, it's still completed. I just know in our use case, any backup error would be something that would definitely concern me and say something went wrong here, whereas I'm running into situations where restore errors actually would be expected. For example, there's a reference to another object in a different namespace that's not included. Well, that's going to be an error because we can't restore it. But it doesn't mean we should, So I don't know if there's some way of indicating, to the user, and obviously the messages show this, but some way of maybe even on the plugin side of saying, okay, if we have an error of this kind, it's okay. It doesn't mean, something was totally fail. I mean, so I'm not. I think that again, the partially completed makes sense, but I'm wondering if there's some other way of providing insight, maybe where with certain plugins, some of these errors are more expected than in others, where any error indicates a problem.
Yeah, so I think long term, the way we're thinking about this is that so we create a log file for each operation that runs, for each backup and each restore, and so you can write leveled logs to that. So you can write info level logs, warn level logs, or error level logs. I think, in that scenario that you described, probably what we would want to do is have, whatever code is reporting this kind of non-critical error, probably just log a warning in the log. So the users can see that, something came up, but it wasn't actually an error that should cause it to go into an error phase. That's not very well supported right now. I think everything in restore is basically logged at the info level right now, but ultimately I think that's kind of where we want to go, and then just make it easy for users to see the results of those logs and pull out the warnings or the errors in the log.
Okay. And this is actually a slightly different case. This is the case I'm speaking of specifically is I have a resource that in my plugin, I realize there's something else that is needed. And so in the additional items entry that we return from the plugin, I say, okay, I also want this thing restored. And so Velero restore goes and say, here's an additional item, let's restore this thing. And if that additional item is one that's not in the backup, for example, then it fails at the Velero level saying, I couldn't restore this object, it wasn't here.
Got it.
But maybe the distinction is this is not an item in the backup that we're restoring. This is an additional item that a different item said, hey, we need this too. And then Velero failed on that resource because it wasn't there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess that's a little bit of a tricky case because it's maybe plugin dependent whether that should be treated as a warning or an error.
Right, exactly, and so there's a case where maybe even again post 1.0, maybe there's an issue, maybe there's a way in that additional items field we return back saying, okay, these are items that if they're here, we need them restored now, versus, and if you see, in other words, maybe there's a case where this is a required item. If you don't find it, it's a hard failure, versus if it's here, I want it now.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I could definitely see that making sense. So adding a field to indicate whether it's kind of required or best effort.
Right.
Okay, cool. Thanks for that input.
Sure.
Yeah, and that kind of speaks to some of the tricky stuff we've had discussing the phases, because what you bring up, Scott, is a good point, that sometimes the errors aren't actually errors. So it could be failed with errors from what we report, or whatever we call that status, or completed with errors. But that actually doesn't affect the running application. So maybe we were trying to restore something that doesn't matter to the application, but Velero itself doesn't have insight into all the application's requirements right now. So it's kind of a black box, and right now we kind of hand it off to the user and say, hey, look at this, and you decide if these are problems.
Really good feedback. Thank you, Scott. All right, next up, what's coming up? We have a few remaining must-have items for version 1.0. The alpha is out, but it's not the real release. So let's have a look at the 1.0 items.
Yeah, so this is the filter that you can use if you want to look at what's remaining in the must-have scope for 1.0. So it's anything labeled with P1 and also in the 1.0 milestone. So obviously that phases issue that I just talked about. There are then a couple of issues around Helm, and so there's a PR open right now that's being driven by a user to update that, and Nolan's been looking at that and providing input to it. And then we'll obviously get the Helm chart ready for 1.0 as well, so that when we release, we should be able to have a working Helm chart at the same time. There's some documentation work to update our install docs to use the new Velero install command instead of requiring the user to apply a bunch of YAML files. There's this issue that Jonas was just highlighting around improving persistent volumes that have a retain reclaim policy. I think it's possible that this one may get pushed out of 1.0. It's not necessarily a breaking change, but the main thing to fix is around RESTIC, doing restores using RESTIC when you have a persistent volume with a retain reclaim policy. But if for now it's P1, so I'm planning to tackle it, but we'll see how that goes. And then I know on the bottom there, Carlicia is going to work on adding some more code to make sure that we never overwrite objects in object storage, or overwrite backups essentially. So just adding some more validations there. So
I actually would welcome help in testing this, because the validation will be different for each provider. And if people want to volunteer to test this code with whatever provider they want, it'll be very welcome.
Cool.
Steve, one thing I see we're missing here is, I know you have a PR up for it, but we probably want to get the migrate command in. So we want users to be able to migrate from anything pre-0.11 onto 0.11's backup format. We probably want to get that out before 1.0 and have it be a P1.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a PR up for it. I guess there's no related issue. Just the issue there is that even if you're running 0.11, it's possible that if you have backups that were created with the previous version of Arc or of Velero, they will still have a file in object storage called arcbackup.json. And we will no longer be supporting that as of 1.0. So I have a PR up that will actually rewrite those metadata files in object storage as Velero backup JSON files. And so if you have backups that were created with a version of Velero prior to 0.11, you'll need to run this tool prior to upgrading to 1.0. So we will definitely have that out. We're sort of planning to release that as a 0.11.1. Basically, the way we're thinking about it is that it will migrate you to be fully current with the 0.11 format, and then once you're there, upgrading to 1.0 is pretty straightforward. So we'll definitely update on that as that progresses in the next couple of weeks. And then beyond that, we have plenty of P2s and other things in the backlog. So our work won't be done when we complete these things, but this is our critical scope. We'll then definitely spend plenty of time testing, and then as many of the remaining P2s that we can tackle, we'll get in there. So pretty much covers it.
Great. Any comments, feedback on the P1 issues that we have here? All right. Next up, talking about how all of you on the call here can get involved with the Velero project. The first one is an issue that Tom Spoonmore opened up. This is regarding letting us know how you use Velero. So it would be awesome if you all could just chime in and say, hey, we're using Velero for X, Y, and Z. We're doing cool thing Y here. Because it's really useful for us to understand how you're using Velero, and we definitely want to kind of showcase all the different use cases that people have. So please chime in here on this issue here, 1327. I'll link this in the chat as well. Of course, we also have the Velero channel, and we are growing pretty much every day now. There are a bunch of people in there. We are over 800 people in the Velero channel in the Kubernetes Slack, which is awesome. And yeah, I see a lot of activity there, a lot of users helping other users, which is really cool. So yeah, continue on doing that and make sure that it's a pleasant place for everyone to talk about anything Velero. Steve, you want to talk about testing out the alpha?
Yeah, I think we've probably already talked about most of these bullets, but the biggest thing we could use help on now is just doing testing there. And so if you have some time to do testing, these are some of the areas where it makes sense to focus. So Carlisia talked about all the plugin changes, particularly if you have developed custom plugins. It would be great to have you actually update them and recompile them against the 1.0 interfaces and provide us any feedback there, as well as obviously executing them and making sure that things still work. The Velero install command is Nolan talked about this. It's a brand new command, so definitely use that if you can to get Velero set up in your clusters. Once the Helm chart is updated, we definitely appreciate help testing that. And then we just talked about the migration command for getting your backups rewritten with the most current metadata format. So that'll be coming out in the next couple of weeks, and then testing that is obviously important as well.
Hey there, I actually have a quick question. Because we've been trying to track master as close as possible, and we noticed some changes that just got merged into released with 1.0 alpha that broke rustic backups for us. So we literally just solved the problem like 45 minutes ago. So we submitted a PR. Do we need to do anything to get that backported to the 1.0 alpha, or is the intention that we just merge this up to master and then I don't know, I guess wait for the next release, or what's the plan to solve that?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely planning to cut additional ones, so we would probably, release that in the next alpha, in alpha 2, which would probably come as soon as next week. I haven't actually seen the issue that got pushed. I've definitely tested rustic backups myself and didn't see an issue, so there must be some difference in error, but yeah, I'll take a look at it.
It was actually just because we followed the PR that changed or added prefixes to the provider names. So in our backup storage location, if you kept the provider names as like just AWS, everything works. But we changed it to Velero.io/AWS, and then there's just some small snippet of code in the rustic config go file that was missing a check for the Velero.io prefix. So it was just a small thing, but we just pushed the PR up. I'm just curious if that's something that you would want back in the alpha, or we just wait for the next release. Either way, it doesn't matter to me. I'm just more curious what you want us to do about it.
Got it. Yeah, I think we'll probably just push it to the next alpha. You know, given that it's not something that's completely blocking execution of all testing right now.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Any other comments, feedback here? All right, we have some contributor shout outs. Steve.
Yeah, I just wanted to go through some of the folks who have contributed to the project recently in the last couple of weeks. So the first one from Amon W. and James King. They submitted a PR to enable you to disable individual controllers through a CLI flag. So they had some specific scenarios where they wanted to disable, I think, the schedule controller, maybe one other. And so there's now just a flag where you can specify arbitrary controllers that you want to disable. We had a PR from iPochi to update the docs to indicate how to use Restic if you're running on Rancher OS. There's a little bit of configuration that needs to change here, so we got a docs PR in for that. SCGO, Scott, I know you're on the call, contributed a PR for allowing restore item actions to indicate that the restore of an item should be skipped. So this is really useful if there are kind of specific conditions under which you don't want to restore an item. Fabito contributed a PR to add some new Prometheus metrics around backup deletion. So indicating how many total backup deletions there were and then successes or failures in deleting backups. We have Fike, I guess, who added a notice. I think this was in our plugin example repository, just adding a notice around kind of the versioning of plugin examples and indicating that the master branch in the example repo matches the master branch of Velero, not 0.11, because there are some breaking changes there. And then Joseph Gorse is driving the Helm updates right now, so this is still a work in progress PR, but definitely appreciate him working on those updates. So thanks to everyone who's contributed. It's really helpful. You know, as much help as we can get from folks who are using it is really useful. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, round of applause to everyone. Really good stuff. Does anyone else have any outstanding questions or feedback that you want to add into the call today? No? All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. Thank you to the Velero maintainers. Thank you to the Velero community. Big shout out to everyone who's participating in these calls and helping the community grow. Really appreciate it. And with that, I wish you all a very awesome week, and I hope you have a great Tuesday. Have a good one, everyone.
Bye, folks. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
All right.